and pleasure to have Professor Yuille talk next about the world, its three dimensions, and the compositionality that lies fundamentally within. Yeah, Professor Yuille is, of course, there is no need for introduction. He's very well known for the work on mathematical models for cognition and vision. And in the interest of time, I'll just give you the floor to. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. Well, the title of The World is 3D is probably undeniable, but I raise it partly because as a long-time researcher in computer vision, I think a lot of vision is sort of basically, okay, here are 2D images, let's do tasks that Fei-Fei Li or someone set up 20 years ago, and let's not move on. Because I think the point of the world, point of vision. Why is this not working? Okay, click there. It's about the 3D and the 4D world. This is what humans do. When humans look at a visual scene, we can, we don't just sort of perform view QA on it. We construct a representation of the world, including objects, their depth, their poses, all sorts of details about it. At least that's what cognitive scientists believe. And so as a professor of cognitive science, I believe it also. But just from your own, from common sense, look at the world, you see it in 3D, you see objects, and you do things on it. So I think the goal of vision should really be to estimate 3D and 4D representations of the world, which can then be suited and combined with language, semantics, and robotics. And I think this requires compositionality in many ways. 3D scene, world representations, causality. I'm not going to say much about causality here, but I don't directly work on it, but I believe causality is a really fundamental aspect of all this. And I think this differs from a lot of the recent work in computer vision, which, well, the recent work before was, okay, 2D data sets, let's do everything we can do on 2D data sets. Perhaps more recently, you have these enormous diffusion models and large language models and everything, which have huge amounts of data, weakly annotated, but it doesn't have anything about the 3D world in it, at least not in, only implicitly somewhere. And so it seems to me inherently limited. So the talk is going to describe these ideas by three particular research projects done by various people. And I see, slightly embarrassed, I see people in the room who worked on these, very important on these, whose names aren't mentioned, but they know who they are. And if you read the papers, you'll see them as well. So I start off with compositionally for vision and language. That was a CVPR task. Then compositionally for classifying and estimating the 3D structure of objects, which relates to some earlier talks I heard in this meeting. And then back again to compositional models of vision and language with 3D objects to close the loop. And, again, just to mention causality and also the importance, I think, of testing algorithms out of distribution. A lot of vision was done of, okay, you test algorithms, you have a nice balanced training data set, you test them, and really computer vision algorithms do incredibly well at that, but intelligent parrots do well at that too. So not to be critical of intelligent parrots, but still, we like things to be, we like to be able to do more. And I think there was another nice paper I read by Bernard Shaw from an article about 2020, which discussed why, for out of distribution, you really needed a model that had some degree of causal understanding about the world, and that testing things OOD was really important. Okay. To make the point again, there's a nice example here from paper from CVPR a few years ago. And so you had this rather large vision language algorithm that was trained on lots of data, would do very well in the benchmarks. And you asked the color of the woman's dress, and the color was orange. So then you were sort of slightly sneaky. You took the tennis ball out and you put in a football or a soccer ball if you happen to be American. I'm not sure how many Americans there are at this conference, but anyway, I haven't met one yet. But in any case, just changing the tennis ball into a soccer ball meant that the algorithm said that the color of the woman's dress was white. Why? We have no idea. This is a deep network, we don't know why they do it. And it had sort of inexplicable failures. So the algorithm was trained well to perform data that's similar to the training it stated on, hence the term intelligent parrots, which I was told by a French teacher in my high school when I was 8 years old, do not be an intelligent parrot, you all. So I've always remembered it. Try and understand, anyway, try and understand things, don't just parrot them back. So the algorithm was very good as evaluated on data it was, trained on, but was not able to generalize and perform well on OOD data, where the statistics of the data are different, even, at the small level of replacing tennis balls by footballs. The algorithm's uninterpretable, so we do not know exactly why it fails or how to correct it, except give it more data and hope it will do better. Now, by contrast, on VQA, I was certainly more impressed or more attracted by neuromodular networks. Andreas et al., Trevor Darrow's group was, I think, the first to introduce these, and which were interpretable in the sense, visual questioning and answering. So these were rather more attractive, and these were trained on and tested on the Clever data set. Now, the Clever data set was, very important and influential in the language, but it had limitations. It's really simple. It's got very simple vision objects in it, and performance on it is pretty much saturated. So we developed a new data set called Super Clever, which contains CAD models of cars, vehicles, buses, etc. And you can put them around, and this is more challenging than Clever, and it enables you to test VQA algorithms. And since we've created it, we could create it in several forms. One form being one where the test data was very different from the training data. The test data could be different from the training data. Because you have a computer graphics model for creating these images, you can create your data set by sampling it in one way for testing. You can sample for bits in a different way for testing, etc. So what was done here that my ex-student now, she's graduated, Zoe Lee did, was you try and find 4 types of domain shift: visual complexity, question redundancy, concept distribution, concept compositionality. Visual complexity, how hard is the image? Is it easy, etc. Question redundancy, questions, may have a lot of redundant information in them. So for that boy, what is the little boy in front of the table holding? Well, there's only one boy there. It doesn't matter whether the boy is little or anything. Little is irrelevant. It's irrelevant that he's in front of the table because there's only one boy in the picture. And, what is feeding the large animal behind the fence? There's only one animal if you don't count humans as animals. It doesn't matter whether it's behind the fence or not. So there's question redundancy, concept distribution. We like data sets that are well balanced. We know in most data sets are not really particularly balanced. So you might like algorithms trained on well balanced data to work on data where isn't well balanced. And then there's concept compositionality. So you take these 4 different types of sort of domain shift and test algorithms to see how well they transfer trained, first, how well they transfer when they're tested on data that's the same as they're tested on, the standard IID method, and then you see how well the algorithms work when you test them with these different types of domain shifts. And you take algorithms, 5 models that were state-of-the-art, at least when the paper was done. The first 2 are non-modular. The next one had a modular method that actually, I think, was a direct descendant to Andreas's method, the original Trevor Darrow paper. Then there was a NSVQA model that came out from MIT that was incredibly simple but incredibly effective. and then our version of this, which was, we took the MIT model, we added probabilities to it. Okay. There's an issue about training, which I'll get into. Maybe I'll say it now. When you train algorithms, most people try and train things in, end-to-end method. Okay. But if you're testing on data out of distribution, end-to-end may not be a particularly sensible thing to do. End-to-end is making sure you take advantages of all the biases and things in the data set you've trained on. And if you're testing out of distribution, end-to-end training may not be a good thing to do at all. And the SVQA model, the NSCL model we had was actually trained, end-to-end on the data. It training the vision and the language component simultaneously. The NSVQA model, the MIT model, was so simple that it almost didn't need training, so that didn't really matter. With our model, the PSNVA thing, as well as our other changes to it, was that we trained it on the language part and on the vision part separately, and we didn't train them together. Otherwise, what would have happened, and what happens, I think, a lot in the vision language work, is that the vision models are not nearly as good as the language models. So the vision models end up compensating for the limitations. The language models end up compensating for the limitations of the vision models. So they sort of get distorted, and they get biased because of that. So a bad vision model screws up the language model. Okay. So here, if you make it modular and you train them two things separately, that can't happen. So you make the algorithm modularly, you train it modularly. That didn't happen on the NCSL model, even though it was there. So here was the neurosymbolic, the Andreas et al., the original paper, NSVQA, the MIT paper, deterministic. And so this basically takes question, you take a question you want to ask about the image, the algorithm converts it into a series, into a set of programs. These can be implemented by modules. And for this MIT paper, the modules would answer yes or no to each question. Okay, surprisingly effective, almost no training at all involved in doing this. Okay. So we make it probabilistic because we're working on the super clever data set, which is probably a bit harder. Well, it is a bit harder, or intended to be harder. And there you can't really think that your vision modules are going to get the right answer. They'll get the right answer with some probability, but they won't necessarily do it. It won't be correct. So it was a modification of it, introducing probabilities, technical things there. Then the vision language components are separate modules, and they're trained separately, and we don't train them end to end. Other than in dark blue, the super clever thing in light blue, you see that the leading four algorithms, and ditto is now 82.65, NSCL, the original modular thing, is 89, NSVQA is 92, PS, our probabilistic version is 95. Okay, so the models are doing okay, but the task is harder, so they're doing it. They are, the thing is, it's not yet saturated yet. Then there was a whole lot of results we had. This is a summary of them. And basically, what you found here was that the MIT and SVQA and our probabilistic version of it were by far the best on out of distribution, except with the issue about visual. If it was just visual complexity, their modules weren't sufficiently good to deal with that, which is something to be corrected. As for redundancy and other things, you'll notice that the NSCL thing generally worked worse. And we think that's probably because it was trained together rather than being trained modularly separately. So the message we get out from here was that at least on this data set, the modular methods where vision and language are separate modules trained independently most effective on super clever, even on ID, which was a little bit surprising, but on OID, which was not really surprising, and what was the main point. So the data set is novel. It enables systematic studies of UQA algorithms. So you can sort of be a bit more scientific about testing. You don't just, don't just test on a random set of samples that came out from, someone created somewhere. You can imagine systematically testing the ways that the samples were generated to find the ones where things break down. Now, this result is all on super clever only. Oh, lead author is here. Hi. And there is a question about how well the modular methods actually work on the complicated real-world data sets. And actually, I think the lead author also had a paper which showed that if you did certain techniques with them, they wouldn't work. You could modify them in certain ways that would make the modular methods work a lot better. They were still not working as well as the end-to-end train methods, but they could improve. And I guess the issue here is that it's to do with the algorithms and that we have the vision algorithms and the limitations of them at the moment. And we'll get into that. So now moving on to the second talk, and we'll come back to vision language at the end, is how do we recognize objects? So a lot of work in computer vision about how we recognize objects is that you train a deep network to do it, and you don't think much about it. So if you believe that the world is 3D, it seems that really you ought to model objects as three-dimensional entities. So this is a long history in computer vision biology. This goes back to the 80s. That's a slide out of Biedermann's work on geons, where he hypothesized that humans modeled objects in terms of elementary components called geons, which are then composed together to construct objects. So that's a compositional, that's a sort of a psychological theory. It wasn't really implemented, it wasn't benchmarked, it wasn't tested, but conceptually it's very, it's very attractive theory. It relates to work by David Marr, who did things like that a few years earlier, and Tom Binford, who did work in the 1970s. Anyone know Tom Binford? Possibly best known as Jitendra Malik's supervisor, but but Tom Binford was a very big figure early on in computer vision. Sorry, not sure why anyone's calling me for anyway. Okay, but anyway, to say, and this, I think this came up a little bit in in one of the early talks. Okay, that really to recognize objects, we need to have three-dimensional models of them, and similarly for scenes, and similarly for things like that. And I think for anyone who does robotics, I would assume that this is almost taken for granted. What would you like your robot to be able to do if you want it to grab the microphone? Well, you'd like a 3D model of the microphone, a 3D model of the hand, etc. And I feel computer vision community is letting roboticists down by not producing algorithms to do that. Why don't we do that? Well, because we are data set driven. We don't have data sets that allow us to train and test algorithms to do that type of thing. Okay. So, so if I wanted, if we want to have algorithms that are modular, as was illustrated, in the first talk, well, we need to have good modular algorithms. We don't just want to necessarily have a CNN trained to do this. You want to have a module that knows about the real world, knows about 3D. Okay, so we have the idea that objects should be represented in terms of 3D. This could include parts and things like that, but the work here isn't really getting into that. And then for these models, we need to relate them to real-world images. So what we do is have approximate generative models, which make two approximations. First, from the objects, they render feature vectors, not the image intensities themselves. And then they're factorizable. So one part of the object would represent feature vectors here, another part would represent feature vectors there. These are independent. Okay, so these are not really good rendering models. If you try to market one of these models to a conference where you are evaluated by how well you can generate objects, it's not going to work very well. But but what happens is it enables you to train the models when there is data available. It also enables you to inference on them well. You know, there's a whole idea of analysis by synthesis, which again is an old idea dating from the 1970s, with the idea that when you look at the world, you have a 3D model about the world that's sort of in your head, and you can imagine everything like that. I don't know if analysis by synthesis is known of in this audience. Inverse computer graphics at a time where computer graphics basically non-existent or was very weak. But okay, the idea that you'd have within your head, Josh Tenenbaum puts this very eloquently, you have a computer graphics simulator in your head to imagine anything. So you should, in principle, have really accurate synthesis algorithms. But on the other hand, if you think back to Josh Tenenbaum's thing about a computer graphics simulator in your head, how many of you can close your eyes and synthesize the image that you're looking at now? Almost nobody, practically nobody. If we have the ability to synthesize things, we certainly don't use it very much. Some people might. My father was an architect. He might be able to do this. I've known architects who are incredibly good at that, but basically, it sort of seems like, even though it seems likely we've got some sort of ability to synthesize in our heads, we're probably, if we're doing it at a very realistic level, we're not conscious of it. When we dream, we don't dream real images. So we've got some form of crude, synthesis model. So this is just an apology, a long-winded apology for why here we use a very simple model. And the argument would be, well, if what we're aiming to do with computer vision anyway, or even to model the human visual system, is we want to have a generative model that is good enough for the task that we can evaluate. And the task we can evaluate would be, classifying objects, estimating their 3D pose, and things like that. So the challenge, I guess, of doing research these days is not just coming up with ideas and demonstrating them, it's getting things published in extremely competitive conferences, which means you have to get lots of results on tables to show that you're doing well. So can we get models that have three-dimensional knowledge of objects to perform as well or better than feed networks? Okay, and we can test them in two ways. Well, you test them for object classification and 3D pose estimation. We can test them conventionally where the testing data is similar to the data they're trained on. But then we saying what's more important is really out of distribution testing where the test data differs significantly from the training data. So this involves testing robustness to occluders, ability of algorithms to generalize to different domains, and they need data to train them. And so we don't have much data. We have very little data. 3D data sets, one of the ones we used was Pascal 3D Plus. I guess Wolfgang Mattagi is one of the organizers. He was one of the people who helpfully created Pascal 3D Plus when he was a postdoc at Stanford. So what we do here is only on 12 object classes. More recently, though, it's working in the submission somewhere, we can scale it up to over 100, but that has actually involved us having to create extra data with annotations so we can do it. But anyway, the core ideas, I'm not going to talk about that really, but the core ideas here are what we can do with this available amount of data and what the models are. So these are slides, I think, created by Adam, which, anyway, yeah. Anyway, the core, yeah, so another of the collaborators whose name doesn't appear on the paper, but should, on this talk, it should. The core idea relates to the idea of sort of round up and compare. So you have an input image, you have feature vectors that are extracted by a backbone, the feature maps there. You have a three-dimensional model, which could be a CAD model or something like that. You train a model so that the vertices on the CAD model can render particular vertices, etc. And then the basic algorithm, which is admittedly not a very sort of somewhat brute force type thing, is that then you put an object out there, you see if it's rendered the features you have. If not, you do steepest descent, you move it around and you align it to the object, you see how well it fits, and that gives you the 3D pose. It also gives you classification of the object. You can improve this in some of the later versions, that has been improved, but that's sort of the core idea of simplified analysis by synthesis, and it's worked pretty well on face recognition by people like Thomas Vetter and so on. So the generative models were on feature vectors. So for each CAD model, there were vertices. At each vertex, there is going to be a neural feature associated to it, which is learned. The backbone is also learned at the same time. The 3D pose and object class are known during training, which is why we rely on Pascal 3D+. And now perhaps there's another point to make here. Again, compared to the way that computer vision is standardly done or standardly done before OpenAI came along and things of that sort, but where we had balanced testing and training data. We're not actually training the algorithm to do classification or to do 3D pose estimation, even though we should, in a sense. We're training it to classify vertexes. For one object, there's any number of vertices. We'd like them to be different from the vertices of the same object. We'd like the vertices to be different from the vertices of other objects. That is to say, the neural features associated with them. So we're training it to do one task, which is to make vertices appear different. And then from that, the models are able to do these other tasks like object classification and 3D pose estimation. So it's trained to do one task and it's actually doing two other tasks. Inference was done by render and compare. Later we changed this. There's a proposal-based method, which is a lot faster, at least for classification. So it works about the same speed as a deep network. Here are results. These are probably out-of-date results, but they're adequate to show this. So on clean data, this is IAD testing. The results are about as good as the results of a standard network. If you actually go in and look at the error modes of these cases, you'll see that the error modes are basically errors in the annotation. Is it a sofa? Is it a chair? These are pretty much saturated. Small changes to the annotations could alter this. But what's more important is you go to levels of occlusion, 20 to 40, L1, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, and then you'll see that that R's, which is the 3D comp, TG-MEN, is is a lot more robust as you increase occlusion. The ResNet, for example, is not bad at 20 to 40%, but decreases after that. Why is it better? Why is this one better? Well, it's got 3D knowledge about the objects. It's compositional. If it's compositional, it means that it's getting evidence from different bits of the object. And so if the evidence from one bit of the object is separate, is wrong because of occlusion, it's not going to hurt the model too much. Okay. So even in this case, I didn't really believe it, but with the car occluded by a gigantic cat, the algorithm actually got the answer right. I'm afraid the funding officer, as part of the military, wasn't terribly impressed with that because he doesn't think that gigantic cats are going to occur too much in realistic situations, which is probably right, but still a bit surprised. Now moving on to the OOD thing. Okay, deep nets don't work very well on OOD data. There's a lot of work to improve it. The standard of performance is probably bigger now than when we had this paper. This paper here was a data set paper. We tried to find examples of objects from Pascal 3D that had unusual texture, unusual pose, unusual weather conditions, etc. And you can see how the performance of standard deep nets decreases when you apply it to the OOD thing. Over here, the CGNs work better. They're not perfect, but you can see how they're performance has gone down to 86 when trying to find this Pokemon bus, for example, but that's a lot bigger than these alternatives. And this is 3 years ago, and I think all the algorithms would have worked better than that. But I think the basic trend will have, is still there. So the 3D summary, and this is the sort of the vision side, and the compositionality here is in the form of the objects. If I was trying to raise these to scenes, I would say, well, scenes are based on different objects, so right, you should identify a scene by trying to find object type 1, object type 2, object type 3, possibly compositionally, and then put those together to get a 3D world representation. That may not be effective as just trying to train a network to do the whole thing, but I would be surprised if it was not a lot more robust. Okay. So generalization, right, this goes up to 100 plus. This means getting more data primed by 3D, but I'll leave that out of it because I want to get to the third part. So the third part is compositionality in 3D. And so we have the super clever data set. So now we make it the super clever 3D data set because since we've created it, it enables you to study vision question answering, where you're asking questions about the 3D structure of the world, the cars, the parts, or things like that, etc. So you can test algorithms in that way, and we can also take a sort of a neuromodular type algorithm, the one we developed before, but where the modules are now these sort of 3D aware compositional models that I just described. Okay, so it sort of marries, in a way, the neuromodular methods with the 3D CTMs. So this was done, so Zhou Li was the driving author, and Xingwei Wang was the co-author of it, was the first author of this. So you have this data set where you can ask questions about the parts, the 3D pose, the occlusions, and things like that. And this is, we thought, was perhaps the first data set that allowed you to ask 3D view QA questions. I guess you could do it on Clever, but then Clever's now too easy. This is a bit harder. This can be made even harder by making the images more realistic by combining them with the fusion models, or by simply putting in more and more cars and things like that, or more and more objects. The algorithm works by essentially parsing the image by using the 3D CTN models to find the objects in the image, where they are, what their poses, etc., and then something else to find the properties. So you have some interpretability there. You have intermediate steps, which sort of make sense. But for reasons of time, I'll just show examples here. It predicts the object pose accurately, is robust to heavy occlusion. And in response to reviewers, yes, this algorithm will work on some realistic images. We don't have a lot of realistic images to test this on. We have to start creating them. These are not actually real images, but they're sort of they're at least real-like. And the CompNet models described, they're able to generalize reasonably between different types of data out of D because they've got 3D structure of objects, which helps them do that. So the summary here is you've got the super clever 3D data set. There's an extension and submission to answer, we create questions about the scene. And we have a sort of modular algorithm which has these 3D CGNs in them to answer questions. That's good. There's room for improvement. I was asking the students, well, why aren't we getting 100% here? Well, it's difficult, but there are certain, the 3D CGN models are quite good, but they've certainly got limitations. And some of the limitations will show up when you've got objects heavily occluding each other, etc., which means that type of models need to be developed further. So for conclusion, going back to the idea, I think we have to extract information about the 3D world, 4D world. We can't live in a world of two-dimensional data anyway. We may need to have models that have, that have that sort of knowledge about the world, that may need creating data sets with 3D knowledge available, maybe to train algorithms, but perhaps particularly to test them to see if they can do this. I've talked about language. I haven't talked about robotics, but certainly I think these types of approaches will be very useful for robotics as well. And so I've talked about 3 projects which illustrate the strategies and developed algorithms, and they perform well when tested OOD, and particularly, I think, when tested out of distribution, because I think that shows, getting back to Bernard Schwabkopf's paper, if you've got causality models, which I haven't talked about, they are the ones that have sort of understanding of the data. They can generalize to OOD. I started my academic life as a physicist, and Newton's law of gravity, that was developed by looking at the solar system, but it generalizes way beyond that. It would generalize to little tiny objects, inside, in somebody's room, which was an experiment that somebody did to check it. It would generalize enormously, and it's only got one parameter you need to fit, the gravitational constant. And so I feel that what it's got is it's sort of got causal understanding of the world. Now, that may be easier for physics than it is for computer vision, but I think that's something we should be aiming at, and we should have models that can, and exploiting the 3D world is an important example of that. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for the wonderful talk and the deep dive. Are there any questions? Yes.
I have 2 questions relating to your claim about the distortion of vision language models in that.
Yeah.
One is, does that distortion primarily appear in the latent space between them, or the models themselves, or both? Yeah. And if you have a pre-trained frozen models and then fine-tune end-to-end, how quickly does this distortion appear?
Well, I guess we didn't really know that. I mean, if we take the sort of the standard deep networks, I think it'd be hard to find out what was going inside. There would be no latent variables to do it. I guess for the other cases, for the neural modular method that didn't work, it was trained separately, we didn't actually try that. I guess we could have done, I guess the view is we had a modular network that did work on that, so we didn't necessarily need to. But yeah, you can certainly, and I guess I'm making an intellectual point here, so if I was trying to get it to work on a domain, if I was building a company to do it, I would train it end-to-end on the domain that really mattered to me. But as an academic researcher, I'd like things that work on all domains, and I would like to aim for algorithms that can do that.
Thank you.
Right.
Any other questions? Yes.
Which thing do you think is the most important thing to bridge the gap between this compositional or modular methods and end-to-end method to deal with some realistic complex things?
Well, I would leave out the end-to-end methods until, as advanced to the previous question, I have a domain that I really care about. I'm building a system to do something like detecting tumors in medical images, which we do all the time. Then I'd use end-to-end for that if it was a very precise domain I cared about. For the other ones, for academics, I would say, well, we should throw out end-to-end to OOD type testing. Because I do think there could be grounds for real understanding that there were more sort of causal relationships between things that we could do. I would say perhaps we should be more like physicists than machine learning experts. Yeah.
Right, thanks. Any other questions? I also have a quick one, but yeah, okay.
I mean, you can ask yours if you like.
Yeah, I'll ask a quick one. I mean, I love the idea behind compositionality, and I've been pursuing this myself, like at least in my head, as you said, like as a simulator.
Yeah.
But the problem is, I think that not everything is compositional, and if it is, like maybe that's not the best way to describe the system per se. I mean, after all, we get, we're composed of limbs and whatnot, but also in a very specific way.
Yeah.
And I think that's the main problem. And my compositionality has not really worked out until today. So is there a way to bridge the two?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a long time believer in compositionality, and sometimes, yeah, you can work on it, and it's simply not going to work properly. I think, yeah, no, I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. I think you have to get the underlying representations out, and for humans or parts or structures of parts and things like that. So I'm hoping computer graphics people can solve most of that for us. And I would say, but I think it's difficult. I mean, that's why.
It's chicken and egg problem.
It's a chicken and egg thing. Yeah. I mean, the thing about we try to learn compositional models. We do things on it. I can get some students who can make some progress, but it's hard. I think, again, from the perspective of, I'm interested in human, how humans do this. And it's certainly that humans do this in ways that are completely different from this. Humans learn by interacting with the world, playing around with objects, using multiple senses. The way they learn is completely different from the way we currently learn in computer vision, with a few exceptions of people.
So we have to put causality.
Well, causality comes in as well, interacting with the world. Well, we don't necessarily have to follow the way that humans do it, but if we do, the only system that really works is a human system, and we know they do it that way, and maybe we can take shortcuts. Yeah. One more.
Yeah.
Yes. So regarding the CGN that you're talking about and such, so to synthesize, I'm guessing that you have to project the 3D model into the image plane.
Yeah.
Now, if this is done during training and stuff, then you probably have to have camera intrinsics, right? Where you estimate the intrinsics in this case. What happens if you were to say, when you test this thing on different cameras, different intrinsics cameras that you have not seen, right? Because we know intrinsics cameras or the parameters is going to cause some level of distortions around the image plane. So what would happen? Do you now get actually OOD if you were to change the camera to something that you've never seen before, fisheye?
Yeah, good question. I guess we're not really faced with that problem yet, because that's going into a level of detail that we may not need to have. And I think at the moment we're training on the neural features, and neural features will be invariant to certain of the internal parameters of a camera. Maybe, certainly, probably not fisheye lenses, but a certain level. So I guess as we're faced with, if this procedure keeps working, as we're faced with more challenges, we're faced with, and there are big data sets on that, we have to evaluate it, then we'll modulate the models to do that. And so I'm joking about, you may not really need to have perfect analysis models for analysis by synthesis, but maybe for certain tasks you may do, you may be driven towards that. So it's more like ongoing in progress. We don't have to deal with that task yet. So when we do, we'll have to improve the models. But the feature vectors will deal with a certain amount of that, I think.
All right. Thanks. Thanks again for the wonderful talk.
Okay.